My name is Craig Maxwell. Welcome, first meeting of the year. Very excited to have everyone back. We have Patrick George here with us today. Some of you may remember him. He presented with us a couple years ago in part of a treasure tree program that we had a presentation on. I actually knew him growing up a little bit. He played rugby with my dad. I did not recognize him until halfway through his presentation last time. I just sat there thinking like, I know this guy, just not in this context. But very excited to have him. He is the owner and founder of Heartwood Tree. It's based here in Charlotte. They also have location in Lake Norman and up in Asheville now. They've been around for 43 years. They've got 45 years. They've got 30, 35 certified arborists. And they focus on how do we keep trees alive? How do we keep them healthy and not just cutting them down? So he is here to talk to us about turning damaged trees into veteran trees. If anybody had tree damage after this last week's storm, this would be a very appropriate presentation for you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Hey. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. I love talking about trees, if it's not obvious. So I wanted to talk about two types of pruning that are done throughout the world, not done very much here. I do have a picture of one outside the Manhattan Museum up in New York. This is polarity. This is intentional. Believe it or not. We here in the United States have some kind of issue about, we're afraid that, oh, this is topping. This is not topping. This is very intentional. This is done over years, and these trees actually build up carbohydrate sinks on the ends of these limbs and each growth point. And you come in every couple of years, depending on the species, on the condition, and remove all the new growth back to that spot. That creates a couple of strengths for the tree. Number one, it stays smaller. It grows slower. It doesn't outgrow its space. And these are based on what was originally agricultural means. They used to prune these trees, keep them next to their house because they provided shade, but they also used the small twigs that would come out. The twigs have an elongated jet on these plane trees. It's just the leaves, but they'll elongate. And they use the twigs for weaving baskets. They also use on certain species as fodder for their animals in the wintertime when things got pretty rough. So a lot of practical aspects of this type of pruning. It's great for employment for tree companies because it needs to be done at least every 3 years, if not every 2 years, depending on species and how vigorous the trees are and what the space limitations are. But it also allows these trees to get older without getting larger. And that's a problem most of us face as we get older. And is one of my, it's something I'm dealing with now as I am older. First, I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle of trees so we understand the timing of when we do things and why we do. So I want you to think about acorns when they drop on the ground. And we had a heavy mass this year. Beautiful year for them. Same up in the mountains, particularly for the white oaks. And if you go to that, what's going on with that acorn as a guideline, it sets growth for the rest of its life. First thing those acorns do is they put down roots. They put down roots because they need to provide water, number one, and then eventually nutrients from the soil to supply the growth above ground. And it also keeps them from falling over as they grow their crowns. So roots first. Without roots, the trees aren't here. And I'll show some of that as well. Roots are the most important thing. If you there's another technique on, and it slips my mind right now. I've been going back through this last couple days. There's a lot. There's a practice where they cut back to ground level and let them sucker up every year. And that happens in nature as well. If you go into the mountains, you can still find American chestnuts growing throughout the mountains, but they'll only get to their teenage years when, much like us, they'll self-destruct. As part of their growth, they get fissures in the bark, and chestnut blight is a fungus, and that's its way in, and it kills those trees back down to the ground, just as they put out nuts, and they do provide nuts. So it's a good bad thing. We're keeping them around. They're out there in the public, and we have hopes. There's a lot of people putting a lot of time and energy into finding some way to continue to grow the chestnut trees, and we could do a whole talk just on chestnuts and how important they were. I mean, these trees were just amazing. Wood, food, the nuts themselves, they just were wonderful trees. So that's the same sort of thing, this type of pruning, it'll come to me, and that's one of my favorite sayings nowadays at my age is, it'll come to me.
Is that coppicing?
Pardon?
Coppicing. Coppicing is the.
Yeah, coppicing. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Need a job?
Had someone in the chat drop that one in.
Yeah. Okay, so once the top starts to grow, then the trees start growing their own food. Now, if those trees come up under other trees in a dense canopy, at some point on different species, particularly types of pines and a few oak trees, the mother tree, and that is a term that we use now, will actually share some of her spare carbohydrates that she produces with those trees and keep them around until the day she knows she's going to fall, and they're established and they shoot up. They'll just grow like crazy from that point to fill in and take advantage of that island in the canopy that happens of sunlight. So that's one of the benefits that you don't realize. Trees are communal, and they share with each other. I'm sure some of you have read some of the books that have come out in the past years of the underground network of roots and fungi in particular. Fungi are the connecting points between these different species. So they allow them to trade. And I had mentioned just the mother tree, but they do share between different species as well, because of this different life form, fungi, that grow on the roots. And just like we are not one organism, I call myself Patrick George, but I have a biome in my stomach that is made up of other living beings, if you will, that help digest my food, that regulate my insulin, regulate some of my hormones, produce some of them that keep us around. Trees have the same thing. And it's a deep, dark hole you can go in and learning about this. And there's tons of websites out now and tons of people you can follow to learn more about it. And there's so much research going into not just the existence of them, but the value of them and how we can use. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I had read Suzanne Simard's Mother Tree.
Yes, exactly.
That was a good book.
Suzanne Simard.
That was great.
Yep. Okay, so, and this is a different type of pruning called pleaching. Now, if you go to Paris, down the Champs-Élysées, you'll see essentially they've viewed these trees, and again, these are plane trees. There are specific species of trees that you can do this with, and there's definitely species that you can't do it with, and depending on where the tree is in its life. But you can see they've created a straight line, which doesn't really happen in nature. But our sense of design likes those straight lines, and so we've taken over and manipulated them. The same as for those of you that have hair, get it cut. You go for a look. That's what they're going for with these guys. If you watch the final day of the Tour de France, you'll see all up and down the Champs-Élysées are these long rows of bleached trees, and they're just like giant shrubs that have grown up. So I hear occasionally, don't top trees, and I agree, don't top trees. That's just removing height from a tree without any thought to the biology of the tree, to a proper point of regrowth and for the proper species. A lot of trees die from this practice, or they get disfigured to the point where they fall apart. Timing of that is critical. Trees have a cycle every year that they go through. And starting this time of year, as the days are now getting longer, there actually is growth occurring out in nature. And you can go out and find some of it. There's not a lot of it. My mahonias, which are invasives, are opening their flowers right now. And I saw some bees on them yesterday in my backyard. So this time of year, they're taking the energy they stored up from the previous year and they're reinvesting for this new growth season. The trees are putting out, swelling the buds, which will turn into leaves. They'll get out, they'll start to produce food, and then they'll push the woody tissue as well. And that's why if you look at the rings of a tree, you're going to have, you'll have the actual rings. The tissue that grows from now to the middle of June, and there's wide variability depending on species, location, condition, etc., of how wide those rings are, of how many there are, but it'll be really tight later in the year. After midsummer, they start to toughen up on the outside. Right now, they're creating new cambium, which is how we transport water and nutrients up, sugars down, sugars and carbohydrates down to the growth points on the tree. Comes summer, late in this season, they'll push out the woody tissue, which allows them to get more square footage of green manufacturing, i.e. leaves. Late summer, they quit growing. Now, a few will grow if they've done particularly well, and some species will as well. But in general, they stop growing about midsummer and they start to put away their savings for next year. So the reason I bring these things up is because the timing of pruning is so critical if you are going to approach removing more than 25% of the leaf material of a tree and the branch material. They actually say 33, a third is the killing point. And that, again, that's going to depend on the health of the tree, the species of the tree. There's just a lot of variables. And if someone tells you there's hard rules, I'd say take that with a grain of salt. There's trends. There are no hard rules. Everything that I've ever said that I believe in has been proven wrong at some point. Now I lean towards things rather than espouse. This is the gospel, because it's not. As they gather, then they fill their cells for next year. It's kind of their bank. So you don't, if you want to kill trees, you wait till mid June. Then you go in and cut out all the green material. That makes them go into their savings account, which was set for next year, and have to push out new leaves to get by. It's a great time of year to cut English ivy, wisteria, any of the invasives you're trying to get rid of, because you'll starve them to death. Now, it'll take a couple of years, but you won't need to use chemicals to do it. I got rid of not all the wisteria in my yard, but most of it out of my trees by doing that occasionally. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a difference in what you're describing with regard to evergreens, considering that they can photosynthesize all year?
There is a difference. And although they do photosynthesize in the wintertime, it's at a very reduced rate. So they don't have that big push in the spring like the hardwoods do. But yeah, there is a difference for sure. Timing is everything on that. If you get near those boundaries, if you're really trying to change the shape or size of a tree. So in creating veteran trees, and we'll get to that here in a little bit, you don't want to prune at the wrong time because they've already lost something. That's why they're a veteran tree. So they've lost capacity. So you need to, that rule walks out the door at that point, and you go by the health and vigor of the specimen you're working with, how long it's been since it's had its damage, and what you can do.
Question, is this a good time to prune the evergreen now?
It is a good time.
Thank you.
Depending on whether you're pruning out of the top or at the bottom. Okay, so a lot of evergreens they're very susceptible to not surviving top pruning.
They hit the wire, that's what.
Yeah, okay, so, and yeah, you'll see some that will survive that and some that won't, but they really don't like to have their tops taken out, depending on the species in particular. There's some that can take it all day long, like hollies. All right, so this tree right here is Uptown Charlotte. This is a willow oak, Quercus fellows, and it looks great from here. This is, I have in the past, I haven't done one this year, or actually since COVID. We used to do tree tours around town and go at different times of the year. Like in the wintertime, we go and we look at the structure of the tree because we didn't have the foliage to hide that structure from us. In the spring, we could go and we could look at the flowering. We could also look at the new growth that's coming out and where that new growth is going. We would examine trees that grew up with neighbors and trees that grew up in the open, and what the differences were, why you could have such a wide range of growth patterns from the same species of tree. Okay, so this is in the wintertime, this is that same tree. Now this tree, one of my favorites, is Uptown, and it lost all that part of it above those wounds there from Hugo.
Wow.
So that tree's been around since Hugo in this shape. If you
So
get
it's
in
what-
closer, you can see.
That's 1989, is that right?
That's correct. September,
22nd.
thank you. So what's happened here, and now we'll get into a little bit on the physiology of the tree. So as trees grow, they add layers of growth every year. That's those rings that I talked about earlier. At year 8 to 9 to 10 or 15, depending on species, depending on condition, depending on conditions. Those trees, the inner side of the tree, the heartwood, basically will start to withdraw its living cells, and they will act as scaffolding. So that's why that tree, as much as it's missing its inside, that's not important to the health of the organism. That is the structure. So living trees in this area are actually growing on scaffolding of the tree they were 7, 8, 10 years ago. And as long as that scaffolding is covered by that living tissue, then it doesn't get exposed to the air or insects and it doesn't rot. And allows it to get to that great height that they will get to. By the same token, if we do lose that, and it's out in the open like this tree is, then it doesn't have to get to that height because it doesn't have competition. So even though it's only 8 to 10 feet off the ground where the first limbs are, that was enough because that storm, and when Hugo came through, it was one of the best growing years we'd had. We'd had regular rainfall all that year. Crowns were dense. Trees looked amazing. And we had more damage on the healthy trees than we did on the ones that were struggling because they had such dense crowns that act as sails in the wind. So like this guy, the top came out. And up this left side here really only goes just above where it's cut off there, where it broke out as well. So the living tree, as you can see, it's this ring around that rotten spot. But having that happen, opening up that rotten spot, that's when that tree starts to return what it's been collecting and hiding all its life up to that point to the world around it. So that opens it up to insects. Yes.
Its roots don't look all that happy either.
Its roots.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
Well, I mean,
you got
it's
the
right
sidewalk.
next to a street. You can see where it's buckling up the sidewalk.
Right,
You know, it's in a man-made environment.
Yeah.
So it's done the best it can, and it's actually done pretty well. And please don't tell the city about this tree because they'll want to cut it down. Seriously. Yes, ma'am.
Quick yes and no question. If a tree has damage like that and you've seen it's okay around, but there's, one damaged spot and you see termites in there, should you worry?
So the question was, if a tree has damage like that and you find termites in there, should you worry? No, you don't need to worry about that in particular. Termites don't go after live wood. They go after dead wood. So they'll help break down all that artifact of the tree that was. So yeah, it may lose strength over time, depending on the tree, but the organism itself is safe from that and will continue to grow. So there's a little closer look at it, and you can see around these edges is all the new growth. And you can see this right here. It's actually around that broken spot right there. That's the depth of the living tissue. That's what the scar tissue is. And so it will grow around that and it will actually buttress that and add strength. It'll grow more wherever there's tension. In the wind, when the tree moves, the parts that move the most will stretch and the tree says, I need more help here. And so they will produce more cells around that. And you'll see that around wounds in trees, wounds that occurred years ago. So here, this is a tree, it's at Winghaven. You can visit this tree. It's in the back. That's me in there, let you know. You can actually stand up. We had 6 people inside that. You can see up 15 to 18 feet. And the tree is close to 100, if not a little bit over that, feet tall. And the story behind that is a neighborhood kid built a fire behind that tree, and the Clarksons turned him in to his parents, but they put the fire out. The tree survived, but it damaged the cambium right there. And so that area died and it went away, and that opened it up to decay on the inside. But again, you can see that tissue right around that, how smooth it is. It's still growing very fast. And that shot was taken in 2013. I went out there last year and I no longer can get in there on my hands and my knees. You have to get down on the ground and slide in. So it will be closing up in the next couple of years, which will be a shame, I think. And we have come in, this is what I would consider a veteran tree. And initially they wanted to take the tree down because of the hollow. We explained how it worked and that we went up and reduced the crown of that tree. So it had all these long limbs on it that did, number one, they picked up more wind that made it move more, made it more dangerous. Number two, because they're so long and reaching out, they were tend to break off more. So we went in and reduced it in January, February, when it was dormant, when it was getting ready. It hadn't put out, hadn't gone into the bank yet. It was just starting to. We beat it to the bank, still there, and everybody has peace of mind about the strength of it. That type of pruning, called reductive pruning, does three things that are very important to the long-term health of the tree. Number one, it reduces those levers, those long limbs that would catch the wind that cause it to turn and move and cause it perhaps to break down and fail. Instead, because they're shorter, it doesn't move as much. It doesn't catch as much wind, and it's a stronger tree because of that, or it's a stronger structure. It's the terminology can overlap and you can get confused by it at times, but it is a smaller tree. It also requires less water to feed those same guys. So it's easier to get through times of drought because it's got a smaller crown. Lastly, it takes a lot less energy, transportation cost to get a gallon of water from the ground to the top of an 80 to 100 foot tree than it does to a 120 foot tree. That last 20 feet is now energy it can use to grow thicker walls, put out more leaves, depending on what its needs are, what it wants to do. So a great way to keep older trees around is to periodically, and I do mean periodically, you can go anywhere from 6 to 7 years to 15 years of when you have to do it or when you should do it. There's no have to. And that is how we help trees outlive us. Yes, ma'am.
Is reductive pruning, is that possibly a way that developments could keep their older trees instead of saying, oh, we have to just cut them all out?
So the question was, is reductive pruning a way that we can keep trees in new developments around? I will say, depending on the tree, yes. What's more important in new developments is what happens around that root system. Because that, as I said in the beginning, that's what it's all about. If the roots have any problems, they're going to show up later up top, or the tree will fall over. So between those couple of concerns, yes, you can, and we do that regularly, depending on what's going to happen around the base. We don't care about protecting what happens above ground. You can damage it. I mean, we do care, but it's not near as consequential as if you come in and put a water line 4 feet off the side of that tree. Because 90% of the trees in this area, 90% of the roots in the trees in this area, because of our dense clay soils, are in the top 12 to 18 inches of the soil. And that's because of our dense clay soils, you don't get a turnover of oxygen any deeper than that. And there is a way we can test that where you take a steel spike and push it into the ground. You can come back 2 weeks later and pull it up and you can see rust as deep as oxygen can get to that. When it gets embedded in clay, it doesn't rust because there's no oxygen getting to it. So the trees don't put roots down deeper than that. 90% of the roots, there are some sinker roots that go down to help hold the tree up. But most of these trees, and you'll see in another slide, stand on the principle of the the bottom of a wine glass, if you will. It has that flare, and as the stem comes down, the flare around it. So they can't tip over. There are some tension roots that lock in and hold it as well. But the roots, again, not just from a nutrient perspective, but from a structural perspective, are the most important part. Everything above that is what we feel the consequences of. But that's on us. That's not on the tree. Yes, sir.
I just had a quick question about the roots. Our house, we had 2 maples that had some type of weed blocker built up onto the trunk about a foot of dirt and soil. And we removed that, and we noticed there was a bunch of roots that wrapped around the base of the trunk. Would it be all right if we fully removed those? They're like an inch or less in diameter.
It would be better than all right. It would help the tree survive, because those are what we call girdling roots. And they occur most frequently on planted trees, because particularly trees that were grown in pots. Because as those trees grew and they were fertilized and watered in the nursery, and maybe they didn't sell right away, those roots start that. And what we found is newly planted trees over 3 to 4 inch diameter, 8 to 10 years later, they'll start to strangle and they'll start to decline, and it's because of that. So yes, I mean, that's one of our services is root collar excavation. That's where the collar is this area in here. We use a tool called an air spade that uses compressed air to blow the soil back, expose those roots, and we'll cut and remove them. Again, if those roots are over 1/3 of the roots that feed the tree water and oxygen, that might not be the case. You may not want to do all of them right away. You might want to do 1/3 or 1/2 of them now and the other ones later. Do the most offensive ones, the ones that are really tight, the ones that are like my belt from high school, that, you know, they start to hurt. Okay, so here is a picture. This is from Hunting Island. And you can see this big tree is tilted over, and you can see there's virtually no roots going down deep in there. He just tilted over because he lost all his soil. But that's exactly what I'm speaking of, and what you'll find in this area of the country. Now that is in the sand, not the sand hills, but it's actually at the beach. But it's the same situation as us. So keep that in mind. Now, another point of consideration, the roots out near the end on this top side, those are the roots. There's compression roots that keep it from tipping over on itself, but there's also some of the longer ones that hold it so that it doesn't go. And that varies in degree depending on whether it's a conifer or a hardwood. Now here's a ginkgo tree. This is in Japan, and you can see people are gathered under that tree because of what it offers. There is some shade there for some of those people, but you can see that guy is hollow in the middle, damaged. He started to heal back around the edges, but he still provides a tremendous service to us humans around that tree. And because these guys are so slow growing, and you can see that they've pruned it for the very reasons I mentioned on the other trees. They've kept that sail that much smaller, so there's not as much chance of failure. And one of the ideas is people aren't going to be under that tree if there's wind out there strong enough to push it over. So it's one of the trade-offs. You can say, yeah, it is more prone to fail. There's no question of that. But who's going to be out there? Who was out there standing under their trees 2 days ago when we had those storms coming through? I don't think so. So, some of it's common sense. Certainly, if that thing fails, somebody could get a lawsuit. Whether or not that would follow through is going to be up to the judge and jury, so to speak. Law is law. And it's not absolute as we're experiencing in our political situation now. So here's a white oak. There was another tree growing up and it happened to grow against it, so it couldn't, it killed the cambium. And that is the hollow inside. You can see the sun shining through to the backside of that white oak. It's a scar tissue that formed around it. That now is habitat for birds, or squirrels, or raccoons. So it's a positive thing. If I park my car right under there, I'd probably be a little bit concerned when there's storms coming through, because there is, from a visual standpoint, it looks like it might break. But you can also see how much more tissue in relation to the rest of that limb was put on there. So it's actually wider than the limb itself. It's made itself stronger. And that tissue is stronger than the cambium that grows up on the trunk here or on the rest of the limb. Those act mainly as conduits of water and oxygen up, sugars and carbohydrates down. This is here doing actual physical labor. So it's helping hold up the rest of that limb. And every time it moves in the wind and those get stretched, it's going to put more tissue out there as it reacts to that pressure. So here's a tree that obviously, this is in Japan. And obviously there's all kinds of damage on the inside of that, but that tree, the Japanese are very, very respectful and believe in a spiritual connection of the trees to us. So they've gone through the lengths they have there to put in what you could call our artificial standards to help hold the tree up. Well, we do a lot of artificial stuff for ourselves, like I got in my truck and drove over here instead of running. It's, you know, you choose what you're willing to accept as artificial or what you accept as a tool to help maintain and keep things going. This is in Greece. You can see this tree has been damaged dramatically. It's healed around all those wounds, and it's still there, still providing in that spot there. That's a bus stop right there in the shade. And in the summertime, shade in that part of the world is at a premium. So I think the city of Charlotte would have got rid of that tree a long time ago. In the city, unfortunately, because of their budget priorities, and that's not from the landscape division or the tree division, but they manage risk more than they manage health. Trees go on their own as they're, you know, we put it in the ground, let it go. Maybe we'll water it for a year or two to get it going. But after that, it's seen as a liability if it fails. So they take out dead wood, and if there's any structural issues at all, they remove it lickety split. You know, and there I've been involved in several trials where trees have failed, and the city was responsible. I was in one that cost the city $5.5 million. This is 15 years ago. It actually cost the landowner $5.5 million as well. City got brought into it because I brought them out there to say this tree needs to go, and they denied it. City arborist at that time, and said we have to sue the city to take it out. And I made that recommendation to the property owner, which he failed to follow up on. And 9 months later, that tree failed and turned a 28-year-old father into a quadriplegic who ended up dying 4 years later because of that. So that, you know, they have a reason why they manage risk more than anything. And the way they manage it is to get rid of it, plain and simple. This is a tree, and this is not a great shot because you can't see how much was taken off. This is in Montenegro, in a square. It's a pedestrian square. It gets hot there in the summertime. And that shade is again a premium. You can see the shopkeepers that have these open air markets, they congregate around those trees because they're spending the day out there in nature, so to speak. And they love that shade. So it's an acceptable risk for them up to that point, and they come in every couple of years. I don't know their schedule on this tree. I didn't meet anyone there, just observing and keeping a record of it. And that tree, from the looks of it, it was damaged over 20 years ago, kind of like the tree that Hugo did. And it's still there providing a service, a wonderful service. And it's only taking up from the areas that we use, that limited maybe 10 square, well, 100 square feet that's there. And because it's so much smaller, it doesn't need that much water to maintain. That tree were full sized, it probably would have died a long time ago. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment, I've been in southern Spain looking at big trees like that where they were, there was concrete all around of them and just a little space that the trunks were coming out of, and southern Spain is very, very dry.
Right.
And I always wondered how in the world were they able to survive? I mean, they look like old trees. You have any comments on that?
Well, it's going to be the species of tree in particular that's acclimated to those type of conditions, not unlike the
Can you repeat that real quick for the Zoom? Sorry, I keep asking it.
the question was, there's a tree in southern Spain that had only a small area around it, like small area around this tree here, and the rest was paved, if I may paraphrase. And yet that tree is big and growing and doing fine. Do they supplement? Do they help that tree out? I don't know if they're doing anything outside of the ordinary. I didn't see that anywhere I went. And I think the soils there are a little more amenable to those trees putting down deeper roots. But I think mainly it's the species of the tree that is the reason that it's growing and surviving there and doing so well.
Could it also be related to the water table?
It will also be related to the water table, yes,
We're up on an island, so
Yeah.
you know, when you know that the
Yeah.
water's high.
absolutely. So this is a tree, this is a Yoshino cherry. This is actually in Freedom Park. And these trees, county wanted to take these down back in 2005 because of this type of damage on quite a few of them. They wanted to put brand new trees in, they got a grant for that. Well, the Friends of Freedom Park came to us and said, we don't want to lose these trees. And what can we do? So we went to Parks and Rec. They said, well, what our concern was is 12-year-old kid gets up and climbs in that tree and it fails. Number one, the kid's hurt. Number two, we got a lawsuit on them. So we approached the city and talked about doing reductive pruning. And we actually donated the pruning on, I think it was 22 trees. And we put a Mankey, that is what you get when you cross a man with a monkey. And had them climb out on each of these limbs until either it started to crack and they were tied in, it was all done safely. And we reduced the trees to that point, and we took liability for those trees for 3 years after that. And so we went and pruned all 22 of them, and they have since let that area completely grow up, which is great. But probably 8 or 9 of those trees have died from natural cause since then. But another really interesting thing about these trees, so you can see here, this tree has high anxiety and is actually eating himself. It put these roots out off of that new tissue that grew around these wounds. And that new tissue is like stem cells. So it's undifferentiated, doesn't know what it's going to be till it starts to elongate and it feels that, hey, there's food here and there's water here and I can eat. So it put out roots and actually harvesting itself. And you can go out there now and those trees are between the parking near the train and down towards the lake. And they go halfway to the lake where you cross over to what used to be the Nature Museum. So I found that endlessly fascinating that a tree would harvest itself. Again, it goes to show that the interior is not alive. It's actual nutrients that the tree is making available to the world around it. So every time it rains, nutrients are leached out of that wood and go into the soil right around the base of the tree. And you'll find at the base of most trees a lot of feeder roots. And the feeder roots, or more correctly, absorption roots, are the roots that uptake water and oxygen for the tree to supply growth. Whoever designed how trees grow did wonderful things for us by making oxygen a byproduct of photosynthesis, but demanding the tree needed oxygen, so it had to get it through its roots. So thank goodness for whoever it was that designed that. So this is an olive tree in Albania, and you can see this was one tree. And it still looks like wool. Sorry. Still looks like one tree. If you go by how it's growing here. And we saw a lot of these over there. And you can see it's rotted out on the inside. We had one that they claim was like 1,500 years old. I don't know if that's the case. I just know that it's fascinating. And you can see the tree is still standing amazingly, and it's still producing olives. So, and those are, you find the olive trees in really dry, sparse areas where there doesn't seem to be much else living around it. They did just fine and they produced. They are under threat. So here is in Japan. This tree, they had these wound wraps on a lot of different trees. You can see the foliage coming out the backside. That tree is still alive. I applaud their faith in that still making a contribution. I don't see it, but I really, really like their respect for the opportunity for it to grow back and retain. And they had a lot of those trees, and there's a couple in Hiroshima that survived bomb that are still around. They're so beat up and battered. They're much worse than any approaching 70-year-old human that I know, and how much they've been degraded by time, and still producing, contributing. Just, you know, they're our friends. And we wouldn't be here without them. So that one was such an outlier of having any value that I could see that I had to include it to show that it's in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. And there's a respect, a real respect for the living world outside of humanity in these countries.
Sorry.
So this is in Swannanoa, outside of Asheville. It's another tree similar. It's died back. I harvested some mushrooms off this guy, some lion's mane, and you can see he's just beat to hell, pardon me. And he's put out this tremendous new growth. So his root system is still existing, still says, I can do something. So he's around, and he's small enough now that he's really not a threat unless you park your car right there
and it happens to fall that day, it's worth, in my mind, to keep it around. And all those exposed areas did not see signs of this guy chewing on himself. But the birds were in, insects. Just, it's a bounty of nutrients that was made available to the other life around it.
Patrick, would that tree, is the reason of its decay, that ring that they put, it looks like about a foot of a garden bed underneath that on the root flare?
That's a great question. I don't. This tree, yeah, that is on the root flare, and that's not a good practice. Just FYI, but that was done recently enough that it wasn't the reason this tree went out by any means. But yeah, you don't want to. You will activate adventitious roots, which will actually make it harder for the primary collective roots to get by that point and feed the tree above that. So never pile stuff up, even if it looks nice, against the base of a tree. Yes, ma'am.
The way you described that made me think that, so the tree above ground, the center part is not alive, right?
That's correct.
So the roots, like in my mind, the roots come from all parts of the bottom of the tree, but if you're a root and you're going to the middle of the tree, are you feeding the outer part of the tree? Does that make sense?
So the question was, as that tree, as round as it is, and at the base, you have roots around the perimeter growing out, what about the roots that come out from underneath? Where are their nutrients and oxygen going to? They're not. Trees dying off there. It's actually, if you follow this new growth, it actually moves out away, and we'll find trunk rot in most large trees right at the center of the base. So it gets walled off eventually.
So does that mean it has to make new roots? And, like as the living part moves out?
It adds tissue on top of the existing roots, which,
Oh.
so the roots will become oblong
Mhm,
instead of round.
gotcha. So it's connected, keeping the roots connected to the living.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Isn't that why sometimes if roots get damaged on one side, you'll see it in the canopy on the same side?
So the question was, if the roots are damaged on one side, will you see it in the canopy on the same side? It depends on the species of tree, how fast it's growing, because yes, there are almost predetermined roots. The roots that are over here on me kind of feed this side. Obviously, the ones on the bottom are dead because my top is dead. But through osmosis, there's a demand that's created, and the oxygen and the water will move transversely around the trunk. So you can see that for certain, particularly on a bottom limb, which is the one that would be the most affected. You'll see that quite frequently. You can also see where if you take off a large bottom limb, the tree will die underneath it, because that cambium there has nowhere to go, nothing to do. So it'll actually compartmentalize around that. So we prefer, if you need to take off a large bottom limb, that you at the very least leave an ugly arm sticking out from there that it may sucker off of. It won't die as quickly, and it will still provide, and it will, over time, it will compartmentalize around it, so it's not as big a deal. Short term, it can be an issue. So I opened with Pilarting. These are trees in Swannanoa. Swannanoa is between Asheville and Black Mountain. And there was a house where this barn is, it was actually closer to those trees. There's 4 of them. And they came in regularly over time, and they started this years ago. I have, while I've been watching it. Let me zoom in on that. You can see on this limb, it's actually smaller here than it is up here. This is the carbohydrate sink I was talking about. It's almost like an independent tree of where it stores its nutrients now. So they've come in twice since I've been going up there, and that was 2006. I started going up there. And they removed all these limbs here. Now, if a big storm comes through, hurricane, or, and I've seen this in tornado zones, I looked for photos, I couldn't find any today. I see them and never thought to catalog them. But also, if you'll see in some of the footage from Ukraine, they've wasted the crowns of these trees. But there's still this scaffolding of a tree left that will put out all these suckers, so that tree will still survive there. And it opens it up, of course, to all the other insects, fungi, arthropods that could use it.
If I would like to trim that, clean that up, where would be a good place to clean up?
Right where the small twig goes right into that mass.
Oh,
So,
like on the top, where all the
yes,
small twigs.
exactly.
Just trim around, all
Yes.
the, remove all the small.
Yep.
Thank
So the question was,
you.
I remembered, if you were to trim those suckers off there, where would you do it at? And the idea is that where that big knob is, you want to cut it back to that knob as much as possible when you're doing it. And it'll put out new ones again. And you can see there's lots and lots of the small ones there. And if they come out in a storm, they'll be a nuisance. They won't be a threat. That's the big deal. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think the homeowner did the pruning, or was it the utility company?
It was not the utility company. They will not, they're like the city, and they only do risk pruning, risk being towards their power transmission. They would prune half of that tree and leave the other half to go. So
If I was to remove those sucker, if you will call, should I remove all of it or should I leave some so they can be strong?
that's a question. So the question was, if she removes those suckers, should she remove all of them or leave some of them? It's not a question that I've had before or that I've actually pondered myself. But for sake of the integrity of it, I would remove all of them. And that's what we have done that for several. We had a couple Bradford pears that we maintained over years here in Charlotte. Unfortunately, someone else got hold of them later and they're no longer around. Yes, ma'am.
How is that not topping? Is it? Because, I mean, it's hard to tell exactly, but it looked like they had cut in a wide place in the limb.
So it's not topping because I say so. But seriously, because we have a plan of what we're doing for that tree, topping is the indiscriminate. I want that, oh no, that might fall down there, so I'll cut it back here. It's not related to what's best for the tree, it's what's best for what I fear.
Is topping bad pollarding?
Yes, yes, it is.
They think you're
Yeah,
pollarding, but
the question was, how is that not topping, not pollarding? And as you heard, said because I say so. But it is more a matter of intent and your ability to defend it as pollarding. So saying it beforehand, explaining it for us to explain it to the client why we're doing it is what it's all about. You get it into a courtroom, maybe yes, maybe no, but I would say that if you, number one, recognize it as an established practice, and we can do that through this wonderful internet thing, pull photos from around the world and say, this is a cultural practice that's occurred for years, and it's allowed us to keep big trees close to homes and people places and not worry about anything more than twigs coming out of the tree.
But it does cause trees to die too, right?
Done improperly or at the wrong, either at the wrong time, too much at the wrong time, or a tree that has other problems, it could be the tipping point that causes the tree to die, yes.
But then the pollarding is coming back and doing it repeatedly, as opposed to what you see with the topping is they do it the one time and then you've got 80 little tiny
Right.
branches now coming and they left it alone from then on.
So the statement was pollarding, the topping is sort of unintentional to the tree. And they come back. Say it again.
The topping, just doing it the one time and not coming back to maintain. all
Right,
those-
the topping is not part of a plan, it's only doing it one time. It's not, once you start to pollard, you need to do so from then on. Because if you allow these twigs to go for 15 years, then they're gonna start to break apart because they form V crotches, which are the tightest crotches there are, and they're single most opportunity for failure in a tree. So by removing all of them at the same time, then you get the same growth at the same aspect on the tree. And pollarding, you're taking responsibility from there on out and you're creating a job for an arborist to come back every several years and maintain that. And you're probably turning a tree that had a limited lifetime into one that will outlive you and hopefully outlive the next property owner. And that's really, to me, the ultimate goal is to get back to trees outliving humans. You know, when I was a kid and I learned that trees live longer than humans, I was shocked. Like, we're the most important things here. How could that live longer than us? And why does it get to live longer than us? Well, I would postulate that maybe we're not the most important thing here. And maybe we have a responsibility to care for and help these things live longer like they're supposed to, so that the next generation of human caretakers can see these trees and understand the culture that created this organism that lives in harmony with us and that we take care of, and it provides us with benefits year after year. Plain and simple. So that's the same, again, same trees. And you can see all those twigs are about the same length. So I saw them when they were cut. I didn't get a photo, unfortunately. They were all bare naked with their knuckles out like that. They were like this. They were saying, as soon as they could, this is in Manhattan. It's a little difficult to see, but it's out in front of the museum, and they have squares where these were all in a pattern, and they're gorgeous. Particularly in the summertime, they create a shade haven at the entrances to these institutions that people can linger, have discussion, survive in the summertime. Plain and simple.
What species are those?
Question was, what species? I believe those are plane trees. Plane trees are also known as sycamores. Platanus occidentalis, if we want to get serious. But, you know, common names are different in different areas of the country, in different countries. They're also called lime trees in the UK. So saying Platanus occidentalis is probably the safest way to describe them. Or plane trees. We call them sycamores. So here, this is in Malaysia. The Malaysians, certain sects, believe that this is a connection to the underground. And they create, you can see they created this temple around this tree. there's the base. They make offerings regularly of incense and candles. And it's just, obviously, it's a priority. And this is in a busy metropolitan area. And it's fascinating to me to see them take the resource and put the focus on that. And here's how trees feel about the rest of us. Question.
We had one question on Zoom about sort of when you talk about other benefits of trees, there's a lot of discussion around forest bathing and the health benefits of trees and walking through forests. Can you talk a little bit on kind of what happens there and its benefits to humans? And
Well, that's just crazy talk. No, that is, I mean, it's unfortunately, it's a matter of belief to a degree, but they are finding that there are chemicals released by different species of trees that we breathe in that trigger feelings in us. And it's, for me, it's a feeling and a sense of belonging. I know I have some trails that I go to, which I haven't been to in a while. When I walk in, it's like I'm home. It is, forest bathing is, it needs, you know, those of us that think rationally or that pretend to, we don't have the evidence that goes A plus B equals C. But we're getting there. And it's really a matter of faith more than anything else. Yes, ma'am.
Could a case also be made that if you're standing in the middle of the woods, it could be more oxygen rich because of all the oxygen being put out by the tree trunk?
So the question was, could it be possible that there's more oxygen density if you're standing in the woods? I would say, depending on the time of year, yes, in particular. So, I mean, most oxygen that's made available is generated by plants or plankton. So I don't know where else it would come from if it wasn't coming from trees. So it only stands to reason that if you're standing amongst trees, you're near the source of the oxygen because it's a byproduct of a chemical reaction within the tree. Yes, ma'am.
You're probably familiar with, I was wondering if you had some tree friends around the area that you would talk about. Like, for example, in Ribbon Walk, there's this huge oak tree that
I'm sorry, where?
Ribbon Walk.
Okay, yes,
on
yes,
Ribbon
yes.
Road. And also there's this
Bunch of beech trees.
bunch of beech trees that they call it treasure trove. Do you have some favorites around this area that you visit on a regular basis?
I do. There's a big white oak in the neighborhood I live in now that was the first big white oak I ever climbed back when I was in high school. And it is actually at the end of a dead end street, and the dead end street picks up on the other side and is the same name, St. John's Lane. And the St. John's, the family that lived there from the original, would not sell the property. And so the planners said St. John's Lane's going through here. And they came in from the other side, assuming that at some point they'd be able to cut the tree down and put the street through. And now it's protected by all the people on these two dead end streets, which, you know, they have to turn around in the driveway. There's not a cul-de-sac or anything like that. But nobody wants to get rid of that tree. No one that I'm aware of. It's a beautiful tree. I love it because I climbed it when I was a kid and it's still around. And I live in that neighborhood again and just, you know, it's great. It's my friend. It's one of the things that inspired me to want to keep trees around. Yes, ma'am.
If you have trees that you planted on your property that are between 6 months to 3 years old at this point, what are some of the best things that you think people should look out for to make sure that those trees can continue to survive and be healthy in their later years?
Double check to make sure that it wasn't planted too deep. If it was, then take the time with your hands to pull the soil back away until you find that flare. And that's gonna keep you from getting girdling roots around it. If it's in the first 3 years, and so trees do not get moved in nature. It's the most unnatural thing that could happen to them. They're ripped from the ground as far as they're concerned, or they're dug from the ground where they take these metal plates called shovels and they cut the roots around and pull them up out of the ground and take them somewhere else and put them in different light conditions. And they lost the fungus that we talked about earlier that grow off these roots. They grow out way beyond it. The roots don't go just to the drip line. They go way beyond that. So if you're going to do that, the younger the tree, the better, because they adjust better. And we all know that, pretty much everybody in this room. That when you're younger, you can acclimate a little better than you can when you're older. So, but yeah, it's to your question, water for at least the first 2 years in particular. And water even when the leaves drop off, because the trees accumulate water in the fall that they'll use to blow up the leaves in the spring. That's why the drought that we had up until late fall was really worrying. That shows up the following year. Well, I think we've had enough rain since then that the trees are fine as far as the water availability goes. We'll see. I'm sure there'll be outliers. There'll be ones that it was too much and they had trouble earlier. And those trees will put their leaves out and then they'll die in June. You'll see that occasionally. It's like, oh, I made it. It's fine. And it just, the whole thing goes brown. It's hard to figure sometimes, plain and simple. But I think that's, yeah, that's all I have at the moment. Yes, ma'am.
I've been seeing with all the ridiculous development happening, there are some developers that'll wipe this out, and leave like a 10-foot divisional trees. That's what they did at the back of my development and the one behind it. So now I've got like 100 some odd foot, what do you call it, ashes that they're bare because there used to be trees next to them, and then they just basically have a giant flag at the top. In cases like that, I've been working on growing smaller trees back up around them to help the roots intermesh and stuff. Now, a lot of people don't think you should plant trees too close to other trees. Am I being foolish on that, or will they get support from these younger trees I'm now growing around them?
So the question was, in new developments where maybe they leave a swath of trees down the middle and then it's developed from here over, should you bring in new trees and plant them around not the base, but around those trees? And I would say, yes, if you don't, they're going to fill in naturally. There's going to be growth that will take advantage of that light that's available, because there is that undisturbed soil on the outside of the cut, assuming they didn't park their trucks there for the shade in the summertime, and the rest of it compacted all the soil.
Just don't put like it's better to have trees there than your lawn.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, you had a question about it?
Yes, I review or inspect construction sites, and on some of those places, there are dedicated tree save areas. And my question to you is, how far away from the trees that are there that are supposed to be saved should there be the safety fencing to keep the machines from tracking and destroy and compacting the roots? How far away?
All right, so the question was, in tree save areas where they have construction right up to the edge of it, how far from the base of those trees should there be protection to keep the trees around? My smart ass answer is as far as possible. But it's gonna depend on the species of tree, how much light's coming through, how much water they get. I mean, you can overcome some of the damage by artificially introducing water, which means like watering your lawn, you're watering your trees. You make it available. You can come in and put mulch down that will help that water stay there and not dry out so quickly. It's different for every site, for every tree. The more just, the more root space it's got, the better it's going to be. It is, we are trying, we've got this, I've always felt like we had in Charlotte this ceiling over us of trees. And now in these areas where they're cutting them out, they no longer fit the house in. They denude the property, put the house in, and whatever happens with the trees around it, well, bummer. And those of us in those open areas are now no protection from above. And standing in full sunlight is not a good thing. Not for us, it is for trees. So it's, it's not a matter of this is the rule, it's to what degree can we alleviate what's occurred. In those situations where you make cuts into the soil, let's say they protection area went to here and then they scraped everything here. Well, it's kind of like they transplanted that tree. That's unnatural, as I said earlier. So you want to treat it the same way you did trees that were transplanted. You want to get them on a watering program. If you can get mulch in there, that helps keep the soil cooler, so it doesn't lose as much to evaporation, keeps it available for the tree's needs, short term in particular. Yes, sir.
I'm curious, because your business covers such a wide area, so you have a lot of arborists. Do you school them on this, not just taking it for granted that they know what you've been sharing with us?
So arboriculture it's a life science and it's ongoing. And I've been in it for 50 years actually this year. And the more I know, the more ignorant I realize that I am. Because every fact that I learn gives me two questions and I just get dumber and dumber. And so, yes, we have ongoing weekly education. Our bigger concern is safety for our men and women. Because we are considered by OSHA the most dangerous profession there is in the United States, period. So I tell them, this is where you're working. This is the drop zone. That's the most dangerous place in this city today, period. If you're in there, then you need to be aware. So I'm, because I have people working for me, I'm more concerned about safety than I am about we pay for them to learn. We expect them to learn, expect them to become certified arborists. Being a certified arborist used to be a grand thing that you could, I'm a certified arborist. Now it's like, are you going to drive out of here and you don't have a driver's license? It should be just as ubiquitous as if you're going to do anything to that tree, you should be a certified arborist. Well, that's a little, how they're going to learn then and not be a certified arborist. That's where you have apprenticeship and you work with people that are, and you learn from them and you ask questions. They say it for everything. There are no dumb questions. 100%, I believe that. 98%.
I think it's written down somewhere.
But yeah, no, it's an ongoing, and the more you learn, the more awestruck you become. Learning about fungus and what it does and how it connects individual trees and trees of different species that's been in my last 15 years. And it's still, there's different type of fungi and they act differently with different species. So you almost have to specialize and what you want to learn and pick that out in advance. So for us, for people that climb, we want them to learn about the impacts of the pruning that they're doing on the trees they're working on. That's like when you cut a limb off, do you leave a stub or do you cut it flush? Well, we now know, back when I started, we wore spikes. We cut them flush so it looked better. Well, that just doubled the size of the wound. So it's an ongoing thing. Yeah, you're committed being in the life science to learning the rest of your life. And I love learning. I mean, it's just like feeling dumber every day. Yes, sir.
How about the effect on, is there any concern for underground rodents to new trees? Our yard has got a couple that are actually aerating our lawn quite nicely. Often, but then we have some brand new trees right in that area.
That's a good question. That's not one I've had before. I would tend to think if they're there, if they're part of the ecosystem and they're opening up that layer of soil to more penetration by water and oxygen, they may be damaging individual roots. They certainly are on, garden plants, but I think it's a net positive. There will be negatives involved for sure.
I was gonna say, when choosing new trees to plant, do you have any recommendations in terms of size? Whether we aim to plant smaller trees or,
Right.
medium or larger?
So the question is, in choosing plants to plant, is size a consideration? I'm not gonna use innuendo on that one, but absolutely it is. The smaller you plant, quicker it will acclimate. And there's studies that have shown trees that are 3-inch in diameter or smaller planted will surpass trees that are 4 and up within 5 years in size, because they spend when you transplant it, the old timers have a saying, when you plant a tree, first year it sleeps, second year it creeps, third year it leaps. That's because the first year it's just trying to survive and it's putting out roots, no matter how big a hole, root ball you get, you're not getting even half of the absorption capacity. So number one, you need to supplement it. Number two, supplement it again. So the smaller ones recover from that quicker because they have a larger percentage of their original root system that goes with them, just because I can pick up a 2-foot wide root ball and I can't pick up a 4-foot wide root ball. So even moving it's going to cause more damage because these fungi are not steel. They're not rigid. Those connections are broken just from that jostling. Hope I told you the question. Sorry if I didn't. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
You touch upon again, when you buy a tree that's been in a pot for a long time and the roots are girdled around, just, I guess when you plant them, you just spread them as much as possible.
As much as you can, or take, depending on the size, I always take a straight knife and cut down the sides, and that will cut the roots that are there. And as they grow in, they'll grow out as they grow into their new spot.
How far from the edge would you cut it? Just where it starts?
Well, if it's, the question was, what would you do with the roots from a plant that you transplanted? So I would cut around the perimeter, I pull it out of the pot, around the edges, I'm going to cut them right there, because that's where the greatest opportunity is to get it away from the tree and into the soil around it so that it acclimates to that.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
If a tree leaning on, they've been there for a long time, but they lean on one side, should that be a concern?
Well, it depends on if there's a target. The question was, if a tree is leaning and it dies, should that be a concern? Well,
It's
that's
still
what,
alive though, I'm sorry. It's still
or alive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we refer to as a Presbyterian tree. we know where it's gonna fall. But whether or not you should be concerned, well, it depends on the target,
The house.
yes. So if it's the house, maybe you wanna make it shorter, if it's alive and healthy. If it didn't end that way, end up there, if it grew into that space, then it has made all compensations for itself. It puts out more structural roots out the back this way and hold on to the soil.
And thank you, everybody on Zoom who joined us and bearing with us with the technical difficulties. We're gonna go ahead and end the Zoom call. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you. Hug your trees.